least one standing ovation before we're through here today. My prediction has come true. The esteemed members of this afternoon's panel, starting on my right, Dr. Robert Artwohl. Some of you may have heard him speak yesterday. He's a physician from Baltimore, Maryland. He wrote an article for JAMA last year, which actually got published, or earlier this year, which actually got published in JAMA, so guess what his conclusions were. Also to my right is Todd Vaughan. He's been investigating the JFK assassination since 1974. He was a consultant on acoustics to both the 1991-92 National Academy of Sciences Committee on Ballistic Acoustics and to the 1988 PBS NOVA documentary. Immediately to my right is Walt Brown. He's a former federal agent who earned a PhD in history after leaving government service. He's the author of People versus Lee Harvey Oswald. He has upcoming publications including Blue Death, Red Patsy, White Lies, and Warren Omission. And he's coming out with a book on also on John Adams. Immediately to my left is Mark Zaid. Mark's an attorney who practices in Washington, D.C. He represents assassination authors and researchers in their pursuits for information under the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. He's co-authored several articles about the assassination with Charles J. Sanders, one of which was recently published in the October 1993 edition of the South Texas Law Review. Also to my left, David Mantik, Dr. David Mantik. He's one of the leading specialists in radiation oncology at the Eisenhower Memorial Hospital in California. He's also a physicist. Dr. Mantik has recently reviewed and tested the alleged official x-rays at the National Archives, and he's going to have something that you really want to hear today. We're going to take, each of our panel members is going to be given approximately 20 minutes to make their presentations, and we're going to take a 15-minute break at 4 o'clock. Also on the panel that will be talking after the break are Mr. David Lifton, of course Mr. Lifton is the author of Best Evidence, and he's well known to all of you. Oh, I forgot David. I forgot Gary Aguilar, Dr. Gary Aguilar. Dr. Aguilar is a physician from San Francisco who has been one of the leading spokesmen with published criticism of JAMA's coverage handling of the JFK assassination. Sorry about that, Gary. Also speaking this afternoon is Wallace Milam. Many of you probably heard Wallace speak yesterday. He's from Dyersburg, Tennessee, and he's given over 400 lectures on the JFK assassination in colleges and other forums throughout the United States. And he made an excellent presentation yesterday, I might add. Also here, in his little introduction, is Dr. Cyril Wecht. Both a physician and a lawyer. He's well-renowned and one of the leading forensic pathologists in the country, if not the world. And he's just recently come out, if you haven't seen it, the book Cause of Death. You need to get a copy of it. All right, our first presenter this afternoon will be Dr. Artwohl.
Okay, can I have the first slide? Can you hear me? I don't really have any strong or revealing statements or things to point out to you today, but what I thought I would do is go through the autopsy photographs and this sort of try to give you an idea how the autopsy was conducted. I think a lot of the confusion, a lot of the claims about forgery and all that has to do because I don't think many people really realize the sequence in which the photographs were taken. So I am going to give you what my understanding of the sequence of the photographs are. Maybe that will clear some things up. Maybe it won't. But this is my understanding. There were essentially two sets, or two times in which photographs were taken, before Dr. Fink arrived to the autopsy room and then after he arrived. And this has been the source of a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. Now, I don't know in which order, but what I'm going to do is just pretend that the photographer started from the front and sort of walked his way around. This is the famous so-called stare of death, and there is the incision that was altered by the Secret Service agents. Just kidding, folks. It basically looks like every that basically looks like every emergency tracheostomy I've ever done. The emphasis on emergency. You want to make a big incision. Someone was yesterday was asking me about why didn't the bullet hit the collarbone, and I think you can see that it's fairly clear here that this bullet exited pretty far up above the clavicles, which are here. All right. You say tomato, I say tomato. I'll tell you what, you let me use my vocabulary and I'll let you guys use your vocabulary. And we all know we all mean. All right. Okay. Actually, right on Dr. Mantik's head right now, you can see the entry wound. There is the flap that is in the up position. This photograph, some people have called the famous black triangle, or reference black. When you see the original photographs, it's quite obvious what this is. It's just a piece of Kennedy's hair coming down over the forehead. It's brown, it's hair. It's no big deal. Next. Then let's pretend that they walked up and they took this picture. Again, here is the straight cut that is described as that looks like a incision. I can assure you that scalp tears can look very straight and look very much like incisions. It actually doesn't look like an incision, but to many people it could at first appear to be an incision. The next slide. Then they walked, then let's say they walked around and they took the stare of death. Now I want to point out something about this photo. I think I want you to see how these flaps are based. Here is an edge of a flap and here's another edge of a flap. And you can see that the flap has resulted from being torn this way out. This bone flap goes out this way. This whole wound is characteristic of a explosive exit wound in this area. Next slide. And then here is one taken a little higher. There is a hole where they made a chest tube. Then, this was the end of the pre-autopsy photographs. Now there's a few other views, but this is essentially a very minor variation, but this is essentially it. Then Humes and Boswell, with great enthusiasm, made more incisions. They cut through the scalp, they reflected the scalp forward and backward, removed the brain, they opened up the chest cavity, took out the heart, the lungs, and then Dr. Fink arrives. And Dr. Fink says, "What's going on?" Then Dr. Fink discovers a hole in the back of the scalp. My reading of the Bloomberg report, to me, indicates that Humes and Boswell did not realize there was a entry wound in the posterior scalp. Then Dr. Fink ordered some more pictures to be taken, and the following photographs are the ones that were taken after the scalp had been reflected, after some bone fragments had been removed to get the brain out. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the last set if you walk around. Then they took the left lateral. Next slide. So then they discover that he discovered the wound, described the wound, saw it was transversal, meaning going through the scalp, measured it, and was 15 by 6 millimeters, and he ordered these pictures to be taken. Now this is slightly cropped, but at the at this margin, there in some of the other photographs, there is a ruler which is right next to the wound, and you can measure the wound, and it's 15 by 6. Sorry?
Please, if you could hold your questions to after the presentations.
I'm sorry, but I wasn't there directing the photography, so I can't take responsibility or blame for any of these photographs. Then the next slide. This is another back of the head again. Now, in their House Select Committee testimony, Humes, Boswell, and Fink actually tried to deny this was the picture they took of the wound. Now, here, Dr. Fink says that he directed the photographs. Dr. Fink helped the Navy photographer take the picture. Here is a picture with the flap held up. Now, remember, Kennedy's lying on his side. The ruler is right next to the wound, and it measures about 15 by 6 millimeters. They tried to say, now it's very interesting because if you see this little, David, I'm sorry, but I'm using you to support the single bullet theory right now. Right there, they try to say that was where the entrance wound is located, and that's actually below the external occipital protuberance, and it's no wonder why during their conversations with the forensic pathologist, they now said in that conversation that the wound was below the external occipital protuberance, whereas before they said it was above the external occipital protuberance. Next slide. Then this is the cranial cavity photograph. Again, this is my orientation. There is the cheek of President Kennedy, there is his ear, and there is his shoulder. And this is the correct view. Dr. Fink said he took pictures of both the external and internal aspects of the wound, and this is their attempt to do that. You can see both the anterior edge and the posterior edge of the skull. There are some of the bone flaps that are in this view that are on the right side of the head. Next. Oh, and this is another picture he took again. This is after the brain has been removed, after the chest cavity has been opened. Again, the pictures directed by Fink. So basically, my interpretation of the autopsy photographs, if you see a picture with a ruler in it, those are the photographs ordered and directed by Dr. Fink, who arrived 30 minutes after the autopsy. Next slide. Oh yeah, these are some of the quotes from his report. Again, he says, I also noticed another scalp wound, possibly of interest in the right occipital region, lacerated and transversal 15 by 6 millimeters. I helped the Navy photographer take the photographs, the occipital wound, external, internal, and as well as the wound in the back. Next slide. Humes, it's very interesting, before Humes, Boswell, and Fink reporting to Ramsey Clark made this statement. The autopsy report states that a lacerated entry wound measuring 15 by 6 millimeters situated in the posterior scalp approximately 2.5 centimeters to the right and slightly above the external occipital protuberance. Photographs numbers 15, 16, 42, 43 show the location and size of the wound and establish that the above autopsy data are accurate. Now, let me show you which autopsy number 42 is. Next slide. This is essentially autopsy number 42. My read on this is that they're still under the impression that this wound is around where the external occipital protuberance is. But let me show you where it really is, in my humble opinion. Next slide. This is either the 16 or 17. Again, like I said, in the larger pictures, you can see the wound there. I believe David Lifton or somebody in one of their books said this does not show the wound. It clearly does. There's the ruler. Again, oh, gee, I only have 5 minutes. Okay. Now, what I've done is, with using the left lateral photograph, I've lined up and you notice that the bottom of the ear meets the hairline. Well, don't forget the head is a round object, and when this is shot obliquely, you can make these lined up by drawing a curvilinear line around that follows the contour of the head. Area B, line B, goes through the external auditory canal and about the level of the external occipital protuberance, and you can see it here, which is above this. So this is where they think the wound is. Line C is a parallel line drawn from the top of the ear and it meets in the skull. And then in D, you can see where the hole is. If you make this line, again, curvilinear parallel, you see that this hole actually goes towards the top of the head and intersects the flap. Next slide. Now, this is the lateral skull film, and this is my interpretation of it. Here is the large fragment that you see in Zapruder film and see in the right lateral photograph. This is the edge of the right-sided defect. Okay, it goes back. This is the area that Floyd Reeby said was missing, and in fact it is missing. What he points to here is a left-sided fracture. The skull is absent from here to here, from here to here. When you measure the X-ray from here to here, it measures about 14 centimeters. The fractures from this point, then down here, they measure about 6 centimeters. So I made an error in my JAMA article, which I'm sure Dr. Aguilar will be happy to point out to me once again later on. But I think there are reasons why I made the error, and I'll be happy to explain them to you later. Next slide. Next slide. Again, this is, I've gone over this, but it's interesting to note that, again, if you compare it, go back to the previous slide. Again, if you compare the height here from the edge of the skin down, next slide, and you compare the height from the edge of the skin here down where they're trying to measure the wound, you'll see it's about the same. Next slide. And again, this is my crude attempt to orient you F8 photograph. Next slide. Again, the skull shows a portion of a crater, the beveling which is obvious on the internal aspect of the bone, and that I told the occipital wound is a wound of entrance. Next slide. Next slide. Again, here is the crater. You can see that the skull bevels it inward, and there's the edge, and there's the bevel right there. Next slide. Now, I want to show you something. If you see this line here, go to the previous slide. You can see there is a faint line running right here, which I believe represents the scalp, skin of the scalp. You can often see soft tissue outlined against areas of absence. Go back to the Zapruder film. Then if you see this area here, notice how it comes back from the ear here. Go back to the previous slide. This represents this area where the skull has been blown away. Next slide. Next slide. And I'd like to say at least one, this is Doris Nelson, head nurse of the Dallas ER, at least one person in Dallas got it right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Artwohl. Our next presenter is Dr. Gary Aguilar.
Could I have the slides, please?
Thank you. It was.
Today I'm going to be doing dual slide projection because I find it much more useful in making a lot of the points I want to make. I will be going very fast because I feel that a lot of issues need to be covered today, not least of which are some of the issues that Dr. Artwohl has addressed, as well as a number of others pertaining to medical scientific journalism and fair play, honesty, and so on. In any case, could I have the first slides, and could I have the control on the other? There should be control someplace. Could I have both my slides, please? Oh, I can control it from here. Okay. Oh, I have a laser pointer. Thank you. And let me go back. Sorry. In any case, the controversy, of course, and it's a very important controversy, is the nature of the head wound. And as Dr. Artwohl mentioned to you, the autopsy pathologist, as Dr. Artwohl interprets it, made a mistake here. But one need read their testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations and the insistence with which they held that specifically in this color image of the wound, that was not the wound of entrance. And they said that repeatedly, in words that were absolutely unequivocal. Now, many people, have wondered whether Dr. Robert Grodin's depiction of the wounds in this model here might be more like it, and I have reason to suspect that that may be closer to the truth than the image we see on the left. Now, one of the things that Dr. Artwohl implied here is that one person got it right. Well, I want to mention to you that maybe that one person did get it right, but it is amazing how infrequently trained personnel did get it right, if in fact that person did. I want to go over some of the eyewitness testimony here at Parkland. Now, the principal criticism of Parkland testimony was that they were resuscitating the president, they were in a hurry, they did not examine the wounds very closely. This is repeated over and over again in the JAMA articles by Brio when he interviews the witnesses at Parkland. Kemp Clark, however, in his testimony, both handwritten as well as before the Warren Commission, said that there was a large wound beginning in the right occiput extending into the parietal region. Most of the skull appeared to be gone at the brief examination. Dr. McClellan spoke about that there was a fractured along the posterior half as well as some of the occipital bone being fractured in its lateral half, probably a third or so. Cerebellar tissue was mentioned. Dr. Thomas Jenkins, who now in the Journal of the American Medical Association says that the wound wasn't in the back, it was more toward the front, said not only before the Warren Commission and in his own handwritten testimony of the day there, but also to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978 and in an AMA News article in 1977 that cerebellum was hanging out of the wound. So they were very consistent in their recollections in those days. Dr. Carrico, same thing, oozing cerebral and cerebellar tissue. Now for many of you that are not physicians here, the cerebellum is at the very base of the skull back here, and for that to have been visible at the time of the injury would have meant that the wound was very posterior indeed. Dr. Perry said a large wound in the right posterior cranium. Now it's very consistent. Now Dr. Artwohl is essentially indicating that the wound extended anteriorly toward the front, possibly, though I don't want to argue his case for him, possibly as far as the coronal suture, which is in the anterior front portion of the head and extended backward from there, but principally was not posterior, that the photograph I showed before is not accurate. Dr. Jones, again, mentioned the same thing, the posterior portion of the skull. We can go back, the right posterior occipital parietal, right occipital parietal. And so I decided actually to go back and get the original statements of these people. Now, many of you who are familiar with Dave Powers and Henley, or Donnelly's, who were high-level presidential assistants and who traveled with him, recall the conversation they had with Tip O'Neill, where they told Tip O'Neill, they said, well, you know, the FBI came out and asked us where we were because we were in a motorcade, and we said, well, we heard the bullets came from the grassy knoll, so I said it couldn't happen that way, so we testified the way they wanted. Now, what you begin seeing here is that if you look back at the earliest testimonies, pardon me, that was a grievous error, Mr. Posner advises us on page 235 of his book that we should always go by the earliest eyewitness testimony because it's most likely to be reliable. I have placed the location of the wound by all the people at Parkland that I can find. Now, some of these are sworn testimonies, probably the majority of them are, but others are evidence that they've given over the years to newspapers, to people who are writing, and so on and so forth. And you'll find a phenomenal agreement by all of them that there was a wound posterior. One doctor, Dr. Geisky, said the wound was on the left, but he also said it went from the back to the front. But all of those people placed the wound in the right rear of the skull, in that area here, where it couldn't possibly be if the photographs and x-rays are accurate. Now, if you go to Bethesda, you're in a different situation. There's no emergency resuscitation going on. These people are watching a leisurely 4-hour autopsy. There's no reason for them to be confused about where the wounds are. Are their testimonies any different than they were at Parkland? And astonishingly enough, they are not. Godfrey McHugh said that the top back of the head, that's the portion that had been badly damaged by the bullet. John Stringer, before he was allowed to see the autopsy photographs that he had taken. David Lifton mentions this, and I don't know if we want to discuss it again today, but before Stringer was shown his own autopsy pictures, he placed the wound in the same place. And he said this very unequivocally, in the occipital, in the neck up there, just above the neck. Well, that's where the autopsy pathologists were kept insisting before the House Select Committee it was. William Greer, the upper right side, going toward the rear. What was the condition of the skull at that point? The skull was this part was completely gone. And you can go down the list. Clint Hill jumped up on top of the car in Dealey Plaza. He looked down from the back seat of the car, said the right rear portion of the skull was missing. Mortician Tom Robinson, who would better know where the skull wound was than the mortician? Tom Robinson said the big hole, only get the back. Emphasis I added these. These are taken from something that I've been writing, and so some of the stuff has some editorial things from a manuscript. Paul Kelly O'Connor, James Curtis Jenkins, Edward Reed, Gerald Custer, Jan Gale Rudnicki, David Osborne, FBI agent Francis O'Neill. Francis O'Neill was very explicit. If any of you have seen the tape recording of him with George Michael Evica, repeatedly put his hand in the top rear portion of his head, like this over and over again. He showed it right where it was. Now this is the FBI agent's a guy who has been trained to accurately observe and report what he sees. Here he is. In any case, the overwhelming weight of evidence is that the wounds are back there. And here we have, Grodin did me, in fact, here I was trying to go through these damn videos and getting people with their hands up there, and Grodin had already done the work for me. I wish he'd told me that before I'd gone to the trouble of doing it, because it saved me from having to show you all these individual slides. Look at all the witnesses. Everybody has their hand in the same place, with the exception of, apparently, Nurse Nelson. Now, so here we are in a situation where we have, now we're not talking about Parkland witnesses who didn't have a chance to get a good look at the wound. We're talking about people that observed the wound in Bethesda. What did they say? Well, now, if you add up the wound witnesses at Bethesda with those at Parkland, I've come up with 42, and in fact today I found 42, I found one or two more, so we may be up to 43 or 44 witnesses now. Of the 43 witnesses, one person, Dr. Kenneth Salyer, said it was in the right temple, but I spoke to him about 3 weeks ago. Now, I'm not going to say what he said now, and I'm not going to include it in my point here, because he said the wound definitely went behind the ear, and he thinks the photographs are falsified. That's Dr. Salyer. But in any case, he said it was in the right temple. That's his earliest observation before the Warren Commission, so let's take him at his word. Everyone else found a wound in the back of the head. 5 people said the wound went toward the front anteriorly, as Dr. Artwohl will lead you to believe that it did, and it may have. I'm not opposed to that, but I do think that there was a wound in the rear of the head. So now if you add up 42 witnesses, or 43 witnesses, if I'm right about the new one, who place a wound all in the rear of the head, and you say, well, they made a mistake. It is on the order, the likelihood that they could have made that mistake is on the order of about 1 in 10 billion. That they would have all been wrong, and all would have agreed on the same wrong location. See, not only error is random. If you're wrong, maybe you'll get it on the left side, in the front, and over here. You have 4 quadrants, right front, right back, left back. They all put it in the right back quadrant of the head. If they're all wrong and they all agree on the same wrong location, statistically it's virtually impossible. In any case, Dr. Artwohl has referred a number of times to that clinicians do make mistakes, but statistically you ought to take that seriously. If they all made the same mistake, the likelihood that that is a mistake is very, very low, if at all. I think it's impossible in my view. Now, what do the autopsy reports say? Autopsy report said there's a large irregular skull defect on the scalp and skull on the right involving chiefly the parietal bone but extending somewhat into the temporal occipital regions. Well, where is that? It's here. Where can you put your hand where your hands go to the occipital region and the temporal region and the parietal region? Right here. Where do all those people have their hands? Right there. Where does the autopsy now say it is? Or where does the forensic pathologist, the House Select Committee forensic pathologist think it is? In the right front, extending up toward the frontal bone. In any case, James Humes, interestingly enough, one of the other major themes of my presentation today is how when people are under pressure, like the presidential aides, they will say what they're under pressure to say. They will say what is expected of them, and they're willing to buckle because they don't want to buck the system. They don't want to, face the kind of pressure that they would be under if they were unwilling to do so. James Humes gives this autopsy report. All of a sudden, he gets to see the photographs. After seeing the photographs, he's then interviewed by Dan Rather. Now, after the photographs, but not after he first sees it, what does he say? This is the first time he has ever said this. He says, and the exit wound was a large irregular wound in the front and side, right side of the president's head. Now, for those of you who want to know where to get that, of course, it's in JAMA. JAMA, of course, wouldn't pay too much attention to the fact that he has now switched his testimony because they weren't interested in the fact that the physicians were giving very inconsistent accounts in JAMA that they'd given before. That wasn't very important to them in terms of scientific validity or credibility here. J. Thornton Boswell, on his face sheet, wrote a diagram and had 2 numbers on it, 17 centimeters long and 10 millimeters wide. You place any, and that is probably the most reliable document in the autopsy because it was made at the time of the autopsy, right there, not afterward, not 2 days afterward, 3 days, right there. He measured it, wrote down 17 centimeters anterior posterior. You find any place on your skull, anterior up to the hairline, and measure back 17 centimeters, you're well back down by the external occipital protuberance. It's impossible for you to be anywhere else. Now, here's a skull. So they got the pathologists out there before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They say, now, okay, now come on. We know, but maybe it's just semantics. Maybe it's just kind of a verbal mistake here. Label a skull where the wound was. All 3 of them put their dots right down here. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, with the evidence it had, the x-rays and photographs, said, no, it had to be up there. Fink's precision about the skull wound. In a paper in Military Medicine, he said right temporal parietal occipital. Now, temporal is here. Parietal is here, and occipital is back there. Right back where Humes placed in the autopsy report, right where every 142 witnesses see it, okay? Shortly after he's shown the photographs, though, he writes this memo to Blumberg. And in the memo to Blumberg, all of a sudden the wound, for the first time, he says frontoparietal occipital. So all of a sudden he's saying, hey, you know, I'm Swiss. I don't need this American stuff here. I mean, if they want to play these games, fine. I'll give you whatever you want. Sure, it's frontoparietal occipital, no problem. Now, an interview with George Berkeley. Now, George Berkeley was the president's physician. He was there at the autopsy. This guy ought to know what was going on. Journal of the American Medical Association will have you believe initially in the first article that only 2 physicians know what really went on. Of course, they forgot that there was a third pathologist. They went, oops, sorry. So there's a third physician who really wanted. Well, what happened to Dr. Berkeley? He was there for virtually the whole autopsy. There were other doctors there, like Dr. Ebersol. Dr. Carnegie was there. Dr. Osborne was there. Now, maybe they didn't know everything, but they certainly knew something, and it might have been worth seeking their opinion. Didn't want to do that. In any case, what happens when McHugh is asked about the wounds and the bullets? Do you agree that the Warren report on the number of bullets that entered the president's body? Berkeley, I would not care to be quoted on that. Now, what kind of a ringing endorsement of the Warren Commission's conclusion does Dr. Berkeley give it? Hume's Fink on the wound wound in the rear of the head. Hume's, no, that was no wound. The lower object is the one he was talking. The lower object. He says the wound in the skull. He says, no, that was a wound. I'm sorry. No, that was a wound. What he's talking about here is this thing down here. No, that was a wound, and the wound in the skull precisely coincided with it. I can assure you that as we reflected the scalp to get to this point, there was no defect corresponding to this, that high point up there in the skull at any point. I don't know what it is. It could be clotted blood. I don't know. It certainly was not a wound of entrance. Now, how unequivocal? I mean, this guy isn't equivocating. He's not saying, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What does Humes do, though? The guys get him out after the meeting. They put a little bit of pressure on him. He goes back in and says, okay, I blew it. It's down low. But they couldn't get Fink to do it, and they couldn't get Boswell to do it. Those guys have stuck to their story. So what happens in JAMA? JAMA, Humes comes back out and says the wound's down low again. He repudiates his second cave-in to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Does JAMA notice it? No. Do they answer it? No. Do they reconcile it? No. Do they ask him about it? No. I wrote a letter about it. Did they publish it? Yes, amazingly. So they published my letter. What do Humes and Boswell do? You'll see. It's great. Charles Petty, looking at X-ray number 2. Is that the point of entrance that I'm looking at? Here is the point of entrance that Petty thought he was talking about up here. Humes, no, that's not. It's not? Humes, no. Well, where's the point of entrance? That doesn't show? No. It's below the external occipital protuberance. Now, these guys are waffling here a little bit. Not only in their Warren Commission testimony and on their autopsy thing, they said it was the right and just above. Now they're saying it's actually even a little bit lower than that, maybe. In any case, it's right and just below, and it's right a little bit below the external occipital protuberance. So there was a wound down there. Now, for complicated reasons that are going to be a little hard to go into here, it turns out that that wound wasn't a bullet hole. There was a segment of skull missing there. They brought in a fragment of skull and put it in, and then when they put it in, they could match the edge of a bullet hole. Now, that testimony was somewhat equivocal in the House Select Committee on Assassinations, but we recently got a document, which I don't have time to read right now, where Purdy asked him this question. He said, yes, they brought in a piece of bone and we fit it in to make up an entrance wound in the back of the head in the occipital bone. I mean, it's clear as can be. Now, these guys are autopsy pathologists. You'd flunk a first-year resident for missing where the occipital bone is. You don't think you're going to get 3 professor pathologists knowing where it is? It's unbelievable. In any case, these are the kind of problems you have. Initially, to the right and above the external occipital protuberance, then the right and just below the external occipital protuberance, then he caves in and says, okay, I blew it. It's way up high again. He's under pressure, just like O'Donnell was. And now in JAMA, he says to the low. JAMA doesn't want to know about this. They don't want to ask about it because it shows about the corruption of the evidence. Now, the only issue I want to raise to this image right here, which is something which I'm not going to speak about specifically, is that here's the only image we have of the skull wound. Do you think that any competent autopsy photographer would have taken only one image of the wound without any other kind of orienting images from this side or that side or the other side? This is the only one that turned up. It's inconceivable to me that they would have possibly taken only one image here. Of course they took more. They're not there. JAMA and JFK, okay? I'm a member of the American Medical Association. I subscribe to JAMA, and I have long stood by my organization and had thought that most of the stuff they did was quite good, and in fact, I was quite a fan of Dr. George Lundberg. George Lundberg is the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I think he can duly be credited with having raised the standards of journalism at Journal of the American Medical Association. Now, the Journal of the American Medical Association's lawyers are in the office in this auditorium today. I want them to hear that, and I want them to tell Dr. Lundberg that I think he's done a great job in raising the standards of editorial medical journalism at JAMA in the years he's been there, and he's done something absolutely inexplicable here for somebody who has stood so long for high scientific standards in medical scientific journalism. It's inexplicable. Stone comes out with a movie. Well, Lundberg apparently reported to us back in April of this year that he went and saw the movie, took a bunch of notes, went and saw it again, and he came out of there thinking that some people had gotten hurt by that, and the people that had gotten hurt by that are physicians, military physicians, and pathologists. The movie, and he wrote and said this in the debate in Chicago, if any of you were there. The movie JFK I consider to be primarily skilled film fiction, very skillful film fiction, very nicely done, but I consider it a grave insult to the military physicians involved, as well as pathologists in general, maybe medicine, and a whole lot of innocent people as well. He was very unhappy with what Oliver Stone had done. So just about that time, he came out with these articles on, you know, just after that, he went and got a hold of the autopsy pathologist, got them in for interviews, and it was very clear from the outset that one of his major goals was to repudiate the propaganda, as he saw it, that Oliver Stone was dishing out. And he came forward to tout his journal articles, saying that I am extremely pleased that we can welcome these articles that are published in JAMA that show that that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone, 2 shots from the rear, no evidence of a conspiracy, and that this stuff that's coming out here is peer-reviewed. What peer-reviewed means is that knowledgeable experts and authorities have reviewed the articles and have said that they are credible and accurate. And I am going to say to you today that that is a lie. Dr. Lundberg misrepresented the truth in saying that. There was no peer review. I will bet Dr. Lundberg tonight $1,000 to the charity of his choice if he can name a knowledgeable expert that reviewed and approved Brio's articles before publishing them, and if he can name somebody that anyone agrees is a knowledgeable expert, then I will send that check for $1,000. But I don't believe he can do it, and he won't do it, I'll bet you that. Here he is in New York Times. New York Times, of course, swallowed Journal of American Medical Association, whatever they say, whole. Yes, yeah, we love it, that's great. He was going after somebody else, too. Chuck Crenshaw said, hey, you know what? 2 things. I got a call from LBJ about Lee Harvey Oswald, wanted to get a deathbed confession, and you know, there was an exit wound in the back of his head. So Lundberg went after him. What did he call him? Read the bottom of the line here. It said, Dr. Lundberg said that the book, Crenshaw's, was a sad fabrication based on unsubstantiated allegations. Well, you know what? He also said in his articles, Lundberg's articles, he said that Crenshaw wasn't even in the trauma room, and that he hadn't gotten a call from LBJ. It turned out that Lundberg's claim that he wasn't in the trauma room was itself a sad fabrication on the unsubstantiated allegations of some more doctors who were under a little pressure, who came forward to say that he wasn't there and were willing to do so and buckled to Brio. So these guys are all willing to say whatever they want to say, and it's really very ugly. I mean, there's some fratricide going on here. This sounds fratricidal. I'm taking Lundberg down. Lundberg's taking Crenshaw down. Lundberg's gotten some boys at Parkland to take Crenshaw down. Well, we'll see who's on the right side of things here in a minute. We've come a long way thanks to peer review, tells Dr. Lundberg in another journal article, and all the citations are at the bottom of the slides if you want to know where to look at. We know that critical peer review of papers before they're accepted is the main assurance to readers that what they read is both sound in content and worth attention. And after having gone through this process, he stands forward on television stations and at news conferences, and he wants to announce to everyone in this room who happens to be, you know, believe that there's a conspiracy, and the 70% of the American public, or 90% depending on who you believe that there is, that the only reason you could believe that is either because you're paranoid, you want personal recognition, public visibility, or profit. Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Lundberg. It gets much better, though, of course. Now, first of all, of course, he ignores the fact that people who spent months looking at that, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, decided there was a conspiracy, that these guys are apparently lumped into the same category. So Dr. Lundberg, astonishingly, you know, doesn't care what he says to people who are knowledgeable about this case. Humes had performed, now this is his crusade against JAMA docufiction, and these are the articles, and this is what the articles say. Humes had performed several autopsies by military personnel killed by gunshot wounds because it had been alleged they had not. Is that true? Humes was asked that before the Warren Commission. He's asked, what specific experience have you had, if any, with respect to gunshot wounds? What's Humes' answer? Now, if you were trying to evade this question, would you have answered this any different than Humes did? Well, my type of experience has been more extensive in the field of natural disease and violence. However, I've had to deal with violent death, accidents, suicides, and so forth. And no answer. What? Have you done any gunshot wounds before? It doesn't answer it. What did the House Select Committee on Assassinations say? Say he hadn't done any before. Lundberg, no generals in the war. Okay, there's a sidebar in one of the articles. If you look at the Siebert and O'Neill report, they named several people in there who were far higher ranking and were in a position to influence and taint this autopsy. And ultimately, that's the question. Was the autopsy tainted? During the autopsy, okay, there was no interference in the autopsy. Fink asked to see the clothes. This is in the memo to Blumberg that Dr. Artwohl referred to a minute ago. He asked to see the clothes. Some general in the room who outranked me said I couldn't have them. Now, if Humes had truly been in charge of that autopsy, And Humes knows full well the value of those clothes. Would he have told him to produce the clothes? Of course he would have. But he didn't. Lundberg's crusade against docufiction. Since it's hard to prove a negative, no one can say with certainty what some suspect, that Crenshaw was not even in the trauma room. Sworn Warren Commission testimony places Crenshaw in the trauma room at least 6 times. Now, actually, I think that's only 5 times, but there may be another reference I don't know about. What do you find from the New York Times? The next day after these articles appear the day after this is announced on May 19th, the articles appear in print. This article appears in the New York Times. And the New York Times, without the research capability of the Journal of American Medical Association, which is quite prodigious, says, yeah, Crenshaw was definitely there. Does the Journal of American Medical Association retract it? No. Did they ever call Crenshaw and ask him for his opinion before the articles or afterward? No. Have they done it to this day? No. Who do you believe now? Who's more reliable? Who's liable to be more reliable? The Journal of American Medical Association, us, the august peer-reviewed journal, or Charles Crenshaw? Well, it's clear in my book who's more interested in truth. Baxter. Here's Dr. Baxter. Baxter's a real nice guy, this boy. Did that happen? Did Crenshaw get a call from LBJ? Did that happen? Heavens no. Imagine that. The President of the United States personally calls for Chuck Crenshaw. He wants to slam him. He wants to slam him real good. That's not what Crenshaw said at all. He said, I picked up a call. The call happened to be from him, but he didn't ask for me. The nurse, not LBJ, selected me because he was the leader of the operating team. What do you find from the New York Times? New York Times clears it up right away. New York Times says that Philip Williams, and this is a week after the article, after Lundberg goes forward, Philip Williams says, yeah, I remember that call having gone through. No one else remembers having gotten the call. If it wasn't Crenshaw, who was it? Williams remembers it, and the Parkland operator, Parkland, remembers it. Truth and JAMA. Okay, so you've got all these things here. JAMA has made no attempt to correct its false claim against Crenshaw's participation. Who cares more about truth? The American Medical Association, the organization that would try to influence your health care policy in the future, or does Crenshaw? Now, I hope that the attorneys for the American Medical Association hear that, because I'm a libertarian and I'm against government running anything. But I see the American Medical Association now as an arm of the government willing to trot it out to defend the government's position on things. Now listen to what editors say about this sort of nonsense. Lundberg says he's an editor. The best editors become troubleshooters, not because they want to hold on to the jobs, but because they're decent human beings who don't want to hurt people by publishing false and damaging material. One hopes that no editor would sink so low even to attack the most universally and despised public figure. Editors are morally bound to take every precaution imaginable in verifying facts to assure that the truth is being served when any member of society has been kicked in the teeth, kicked in the pants. Have they done that? Okay, the most astonishing thing of all is, here's George Lundberg. Now, a year after going forward to announce to the world that they can take his word for it on the basis of irrefutable proof, his words, and you'll never find those words in any other scientific article than in JAMA's articles on JFK, irrefutable proof. They trot out, this is propaganda 101. I mean, I don't know where he got this, but it's unbelievable. I'm really not much of an expert in this thing at all, he says, regarding the JFK assassination. It's really never been all that interesting to me in the last year or so. My role in that, the debate on that day, and this whole thing, is that of a journalist. Well, he's not much of a journalist, and he's not much of a scientist, and it's an embarrassment the American Medical Association and the Journal of American Medical Association would trot somebody out that doesn't know anything about a subject, present him as an expert to the world, and of course what happens? All the newspapers swallow it whole. It's phenomenal. Now, what's in the journal? After all these lies and all these untruths and all these factual inaccuracies, you get Dennis Brio saying that this special JFK JAMA report is their attempt to confront the defamers of the truth. I mean, what hypocrisy. Now, this goes on with what the pathologists have said, and I'm not going to go through all their inconsistent testimonies, but you can see Carrico here changes his testimony when he testifies before the Warren Commission under ways that are very much similar. He changes temporal he changes occipital, which is what he wrote that day when he reads his handwritten testimony into the record, to say temporal, because he's trying to move it up there the way everybody seems to want to move this wound away from the back of the head. He's more than happy to do that. Temporal and parietal, you can see he also moves it. He says temporal parietal. What he originally wrote was occipital. Cyril Wecht writes a letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association. I wrote one, was published. David Mantik wrote one, which was published. That's how I got to meet David Mantik. This is their regard for truth, the autopsy pathologists. They didn't answer a single question. Fink didn't answer a single question. They didn't appear with Lundberg in news conferences. And then the most astonishing thing of all, which I'll leave you with, I have many more slides, but I don't have the time, is that I happen to be Gerald Posner's physician, okay? She's my patient. Gerald Posner's mother's physician. I'm Gerald Posner's mother's physician. I met Gerald Posner face to face. A month after Humes and Boswell refused to answer our letters in the Journal of the American Medical Association, if you read page 300 of Posner's book, he gets an interview with Humes a month later. Okay? I went up to Posner and said, how the hell did you get a hold of Humes? I mean, he won't answer my letters, he won't answer anybody's letters, Wecht's or any other person's letters. He said, oh, Journal of the American Medical Association put me in touch with him. So you can see that there is some incredible bias here, and the American Medical Association is not interested in the truth. The truth is that there is a defect here. The truth is that the photographs and x-rays are not reliable depictions of those wounds, and I think that you can believe anything you want, but by the consistency that the American Medical Association has pursued this topic, it is a scientific embarrassment to me, and I hope that they're not given any power when it's time to run American medicine through the government.
Thank you, Dr. Aguilar. I told you there'd be at least one standing ovation. I don't think we're over yet. I want to apologize to Dr. Artwohl. He's pointed out that apparently the ground rules stated that speakers could not lend time to other speakers. Dr. Wecht has been kind enough to give an extra 5 minutes to Dr. Aguilar so he could complete his presentation. And in view of that, that's my mistake, nobody else's mistake, I'm going to give Dr. Artwohl some additional time at the end to have his rebuttal time if he wants it. Okay, our next speaker is going to be Todd Wayne Vaughan.
The first slide, please. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of ASK for allowing me to speak here, and I want to thank all the panel members here who, although I disagree with most of them, in fact, almost all of them, I have great respect for all of them. I got about 140 slides to go through, so I want to get started real quick, and I'm starting to lose my voice because I'm starting to get a little bit of a cold, so if you just bear with me. What I want to talk about is the trajectory of the single bullet theory, which I think has gotten a bad rap over the years. And I want to preface that with something that I'm not a forensic pathologist, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not an engineer, but what I do here, I don't think you really have to be in any of those things to go through this. So the first thing I want to show is some slides that depict how the trajectory has been shown over the years by critics and researchers who at one time, believe it or not, I was one myself. And I can't go through in every detail in every one, but believe me, there's many errors in these. I think that some of the errors are the bodies are not accurately drawn, the limousine is not accurately depicted, and I'll just go through those real quick. Maybe.
It's probably the other remote.
It's a different one.
Do the next slide. Can you do it?
Okay, if you look at all these, and we can go through these. I think there's serious problems with all these. The bodies are not really accurate diagrams of human anatomy, human bodies. In several instances, the limousine and the drawings you see will not be to scale. These just do not reflect the way the limousine was and the way the bodies were in this car. So what I've done is I want to go through and show you my own analysis of the trajectory, the feasibility of the trajectory of the single bullet theory. First of all, I accept that the autopsy photographs and x-rays are genuine. They were looked at by some of the leading experts of the House Select Committee on Assassination, leading photographic experts and forensic anthropologists, and they all concluded that they were unaltered, unretouched, and they were in fact the x-rays and photographs of President Kennedy. This is the Fox photo. The wound that I believe is an exit wound is located within this incision. Now, if you go and look at photographs of President Kennedy at Love Field, you can see where that wound would be. That wound is going to be below the collar line, behind the knot of the tie. This is President Kennedy's shirt, which has corresponding exit defects. His tie, which had a nick on the left side, and that's going to be very important in the next slide. If you look at this photograph of President Kennedy in the limousine, you can note that as he turns his head to the right, his entire collar and tie rotate with him to the right. And I believe that when you see the trajectory analysis I've done, that this allows the bullet to exit and nick the left side of the tie. Also note the suit coat position, and note where his arm is, and note that he is to the extreme outside edge of the limousine. In fact, I think the underside of his chest right here is probably even pressing up right up against that side. There's several other photos that show this. The wound in the back, of course, much discussion over this because the wound in the clothing is 5 inches below the collar line. And when the FBI did a reconstruction in Dealey Plaza, an agent wore a jacket that had a marking on it showing where those holes were. But when you go and look at photographs of the motorcade, I think this is very important, and this question came up yesterday. You go to the photographs throughout the motorcade, and you can see that President Kennedy's suit coat is hunching up through the entire motorcade. Well, that's all right. You can look at this and see for yourself. I don't think there'll be any question about this. That one's a little hard to see, but I guarantee you that is hunching up. And I don't think there's any question about it in this one here. This is the Croft 3 photograph, which is taken 3 seconds before I think the president was hit in the back. It's at frame 161 of the Zapruder film, and it's a little underexposed, but if you look very carefully, you can see that the right side of the suit coat is hunched up. I want you also to notice how President Kennedy is sitting with the shoulders a little rounded, his head a little bit forward. And notice the height of President Kennedy in relation to Governor Connally. Governor Connally was sitting in a jump seat and was significantly lower than President Kennedy. This is the autopsy face sheet, which a lot of discussion about this, showing the back wound apparently in the back. And Dr. Boswell and Humes have said this is simply a diagram and not meant to exactly position the wound, and what you have to do is take the measurement next to this. And I went back and I looked at Oswald's autopsy face sheet. And I looked at the wounds here, and I know that you have the same thing occurring here. You have, Dr. Rose has drawn the locations of some of the wounds on the face sheet, and you see that some of them are the same level, but when you look at the measurements, they're completely different. So I think that this is a possible explanation for some of this controversy over this. And as far as the probing of the wound, both Dr. Humes and Dr. Fink said that they inserted a probe into this back wound, and they could not get this probe to go through. They thought the bullet stopped short. But if you look at the musculature, the underlying musculature of the back, you see there's numerous muscles that overlap and override each other. And depending on how the orientation is when you're hit, if President Kennedy, as I believe, was struck when his arm is up, when you put him in the autopsy table and his arm down, you get a change of the orientation of those muscles. And in fact, in the autopsy of Robert Kennedy, Dr. Noguchi, when trying to probe one of the wounds in Robert Kennedy's back, encountered the same problem. He could not get the probe to go through until he raised Robert Kennedy's right arm, and then the probe went through. And this is his grand jury testimony to that effect. This is the x-ray of President Kennedy. I think it's important that it shows no bony damage, with possibly, according to some of the experts, a graze of the tip of the right transverse process of the first thoracic vertebra. And President Kennedy had a bruise at the top of his right lung, which, as you see here, comes to the level of about T1. This is the left lateral photograph, and I'm going to show you an analysis similar to the one Dr. Artwohl did yesterday during the case closed panel, but I assure you that I did this completely independent of him. In fact, I had this done before I even met him. I met him in April, and I think it's amazing we came to basically the same conclusion. Okay, I think that when you turn the photograph like this, that this is how President Kennedy is sitting in the motorcade. And I think when you look at photographs of the motorcade, you can see that I think this is correct. You can see his shoulders are rounded, his head is erect. And as you go through these photographs, you can see this. Quite clearly here, his shoulders are rounded, he's leaning forward slightly, his head is erect. You can see that clearly here, I believe, also. Also here, and also know how much lower Governor Connally is than President Kennedy. This is a photograph from Gary Savage and Rusty Livingston's book, JFK First Day Evidence, which they graciously gave me a copy. And I think this one clearly shows the way President Kennedy was sitting in his car. And I think this is consistent with the F4 photograph. So when you look at the F4 photograph, you can see where the tracheotomy incision is right there. The problem is you cannot see the back wound. But what you can see is the President's ear, the height of the ear, and you can see these folds. So what I did was, realizing that the head is tilted backwards somewhat, I measured the distance of the ear from top to bottom. And I also measured the distance from the back wound to the most inferior fold. And I found that that distance is the same. And when you go to the left lateral photograph and apply this, you can approximate, and I stress approximate, where that wound is down in the back. And then you can plot out a possible trajectory for that. And overlaying the suit coat and the shirt, and you can see how that can accommodate that trajectory and how you can get those holes in those clothing that way. And this trajectory is 20 degrees, exactly 20 degrees. And where I believe President Kennedy is struck, the trajectory back to the depository is exactly 20 degrees. You can apply, then when you take this angle, you can apply this to some of the motorcade photographs. And this is an interesting photograph of President Kennedy. You can see the shape of his back, which corresponds, I think, quite well to how he's in the F4 photograph. You can see that he does have an overdeveloped set of trapezius muscles. And when you do the same thing with the same measurements and you approximate the position of the tracheotomy incision, you can see you get the same downward trajectory. And I did an overlay on this photograph here, where I do the same thing with the same trajectory at 20 degrees, and if that bullet strikes here, exits here, that bullet is on a direct course for Governor Connolly's back wound. And also here. Another important thing is the position of Governor Connolly in relation to President Kennedy. It's always said that he was sitting directly in front of him, and I don't think, while I agree he's in front of him, I don't think he's directly in front of him. And I think that these series of photographs will show that. I think you can see here that President Kennedy is to the extreme right side of the car. Governor Connolly is a little bit more to the inside of the car. In fact, that's how the jump seat was laid out. President Kennedy's arm is over the side of the car, while Governor Connolly's is inside the car. Another photograph, I think, that's showing President Kennedy to the right side, Governor Connolly to the inside. Another one here. These photos, I think, are remarkable because I think you can see both President Kennedy to the extreme right side, Governor Connolly certainly more to the center of the car. And this one, I think, is perhaps the most important. Almost taken from directly above, looking straight at the limousine. And when you draw a line parallel to the right edge of the limousine, and draw a line parallel to that from President Kennedy's throat, you can see that that line passes Governor Connolly's right shoulder. And a hypothetical trajectory can accommodate those wounds. As I'll show, I think President Kennedy is shot when he's looking to the right. And if he turns his head to the right, as I showed in the other photograph, his collar and his suit coat and everything will rotate to the right, and all that will line up. This is frame 154, I believe. President Kennedy is looking to the right, or to the left, I'm sorry. Governor Connolly is looking to the left, and Mrs. Kennedy is looking to the left. And here, very swiftly, we see some changes start to occur. President Kennedy begins to look to the right. Governor Connolly will begin to turn his head to the right. Mrs. Kennedy begins to turn her head to the right. In the case of Mrs. Kennedy and Governor Connolly, these are all actions they said they did after the first shot. There was some discussion earlier that there's evidence of a shot striking President Kennedy in the throat from the front at around frame 180, 189, or in that area. I don't agree with that for different reasons. I don't see any evidence during these frames of President Kennedy reacting to anything The only thing I see him doing is waving and then beginning to stop waving, and he begins to bring his hand down. Now, this is as Governor Connolly begins to come out from behind the sign, and I want you to notice the position of Governor Connolly's lapels, and this is the infamous lapel flap. The wound to Governor Connolly's chest, the exit wound, was at the right front of his chest, below the nipple. These are the FBI lab worksheets on his clothing showing approximately where the wounds were, or I'm sorry, where the holes in the clothing were. And if you look at Governor Connolly, you can see his tie and you can see the white of his coat, or the white of his shirt, on both sides of the lapel of his coat. And if you also look right here, you can see what I believe is a portion of his right hand holding his Stetson hat. And in the very next frame, the lapel is suddenly pushed forward. And I don't think this is necessarily this portion of the lapel as opposed to the right front of the suit coat, or maybe a combination of the two. And notice that Governor Connolly's right hand is now out of view also. And then in the very next frame, the right hand is back in view. If I can back up one. Note here President Kennedy's hand. President Kennedy's hand is here. You can measure the distance from his shoulder to the top of his hand. And if you look in the next frame, you can see that that distance has increased. His hand has dropped. I don't think he is yet responding to being hit, although I think they were both hit approximately a frame and a half before this. This is from the FBI reconstruction, the view from the window at that time, and you have a trajectory of 20 degrees downward. And I think you can, if you look at this, you can see Governor Connolly beginning to react, President Kennedy beginning to react. His arms are coming up. Governor Connolly, his arm has jumped up very rapidly. This is the hat flip motion, which has gotten some attention. His hat is right here in front of his chest. And this is frame 230. And I think if you look at frame 230, and if you compare Governor Connolly's right shoulder to the right shoulder of Agent Kellerman, the right shoulder of Mrs. Kennedy, and the horizontal axis of the limousine from right to left, you can see that Governor Connolly's shoulder is depressed. And I think his right hand is up holding that hat in a very unnatural position up here. I think he has been shot through the chest, through the wrist, into the thigh, and in reaction to that, he has raised that hand up and clamped it over his chest. And I think the following frames show Governor Connolly continuing to react. All right, this is frame 225. I think both men are hit by one shot about 1.5 frames before this, but you can't see President Kennedy in that frame because he's behind the sign. So what I've done is I've made an overlay of the body positions on here, and then transferred this and sketched in the rest of the body, removed that, and you can see, I think, that if you line up the wound positions, you can accommodate a single bullet at this time. And this is a view that is parallel to the trajectory of the bullet. This is a view to the other side. And this is a section of section through Dealey Plaza with the drawing of both men laid here. And you can see that that trajectory will run right back to the 6th floor window. In the horizontal view, I took a scale drawing of the limousine and very carefully positioned President Kennedy and Governor Connolly in the car, using different photographs at the time of the assassination, different angle measurements, knowing from where Zapruder is. You can see I have President Kennedy to the extreme right side of the car. Governor Connolly is square on the jump seat. I mean, all these other, the NOVA and the House Committee consistently have him off the side of the jump seat. And when you line up all the wounds, you can see that this bullet can pass through both men in a straight line. And this trajectory is 8 degrees. I'm sorry? Whose hand? No, his hand is right here. I believe his hand is down in front of him, below the level of the line of sight from Zapruder to the limousine. And when you put this on a scale map of Dealey Plaza at the same frame, this trajectory will run right back to the 6th floor window depository. And this is the last slide. This is another drawing showing how one bullet can pass through both men at that angle. And I want to stress that that angle, that 20-degree angle, is the angle that I got when I did the analysis on the F4 photograph. That was the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. Our next speaker will be Walt Brown.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be speaking to you about the legal case this afternoon with respect to Mr. Oswald. And I'm going to apologize to you because I didn't bring any gory pictures with me. But I also didn't bring any lone assassin fantasies either, so it works out. Thank you. For those of you who's familiar with my work, I put Oswald on trial, and I'll try and run through the legal case with you. Certainly there is evidence. However, I'm going to take exception with everything that's been said to this point about the word autopsy, because there never was one anywhere. We know they didn't do one at Parkland Hospital, and the question should be, why not? Why didn't some law enforcement people insist that the proper procedure be followed, and it wasn't? What happened at Bethesda that evening was a very interesting pathological examination, but it wasn't an autopsy. There are a volume of concerns, again, which I pointed out. Many of them are tainted evidence, many of them poorly handled evidence. Some are badly over-publicized, or in the case of such things as David Ferry's library card or the so-called palm print, they're under-publicized evidence. And some are just circumstantial bits of evidence suggestive more of stage props. And it would be in a feature called JFK: The Final Seconds, starring Lee Oswald. The rifle, which I call the magic rifle. And I do believe there was a magic bullet, because I think it appeared from nowhere. The magic rifle, we know, was purchased by Oswald, but it was a 6.5 Mannlicher, and we've heard discussion today about a wound entering the skull 15 by 6 millimeters. Now, the doctors can probably explain it better than I can, but a 6.5 bullet makes a 6.5 hole. If that hole is 15 by 6, what made it? It wasn't a 6.5 millimeter bullet. Was it a Mannlicher Carcano found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository? We've seen photographic evidence this morning suggesting that it wasn't, or it was one of 3 Mannlichers. Interestingly enough, in 17,740 pages of published Warren Commission material, there is not one picture of a Mauser. The easiest thing in the world to do would be to say, here's what a Mauser looks like, you decide. Could it have been an honest mistake? Had the gun been fired? We've never yet been told by one living individual that there's evidence that that gun had been fired. It's a stage prop. There's a clip there of unknown origin because it does not come with the rifle. As Mr. Frazier of the FBI testified, he bought the gun immediately to find out, and it came without a clip. The clip was also still present when found, and when that last round goes into the chamber, it ejects the clip. The FBI found no prints, and they questioned Dallas's honesty with respect to the prints. And that's kind of an odd thing to find in law enforcement. It's very rare you're going to find one law enforcement officer disregarding another. We also have certain questions about the capabilities of that gun. There are also questions about chain of possession, because as you know, the FBI kidnapped the weapon on midnight, and no jurisdictional officer went with it. So while it's a gun in evidence, it's taken out of evidence when it leaves Dallas custody. With respect to the trajectories, we've heard a lot about exactly 20 degrees and whatnot. The FBI and the Warren Commission pulled a little bit of a fast one on us on that one. What they're telling you when they talk about 20 degrees is they're talking about the angle from the window to the street. Well, the street wasn't shot. All right? The street is horizontal. The individual shot is vertical. And if it's 20 degrees to the street, then a straight line is 90 degrees. It means the angle is about 65 to 70 degrees, which is very consistent with what the people at the pathological examination that evening discovered. The bullet entered down and low, and it was too steep an angle. I will suggest, however, in deference to what the other gentlemen have said about the coat being hunched up, think about this. If that coat had been normal, and if those holes were made by a bullet with a coat not hunched up, going from right to left, that wound would have been fatal because it would have gone through the president's heart. So that coat did have to come up somehow. It can't be as worn. You can't have it both ways, unfortunately. With respect to the shells that were found, we know one of them was unusable. There's further problems with the chain of possession there. They turn up here, they turn up there, and even with the tippet shells later on, they go looking for them in a drawer in the Dallas Police Headquarters in March. The shells matched the ejector marks of the C2766 Mannlicher, but they're not time-stamped. Those shells could have come out of that gun on November 22nd of 1963 or in 1941 when the gun was made for World War II. Fingerprints. There are fingerprints of Lee Oswald all over the Texas School Book Depository, and I'm not surprised in as much as he was employed there. Oddly enough, there was never, with respect to the crime, there was never found one fingerprint on a fixed object. What are the fingerprints on? They're on movable boxes, they're on a rifle, and they're on a bag which we are asked to believe was located up in that little configuration of boxes. But magically the window opened, someone leaned out the window to take one or more shots with a rifle, but did not leave any prints in so doing. But there are prints all over, again, non-fixed objects, and there are many other fingerprints on those cartons developed by the FBI, who then fingerprinted the entire staff of the depository, only to discover that they didn't match up with anybody. And I can tell you something, fingerprints don't last very long on cardboard. It wasn't as if whoever sent those boxes of books to the depository left those fingerprints. They were made by strangers up there. The bag had an Oswald print on it. It matches the gun signs, but it wasn't photographed at the scene. If you're a juror, you're asked to take on blind faith that that bag was in fact there. Of equal interest in what I consider the immaculate deception, a second bag was mailed to Lee Oswald and turned up in the dead letter office at the post office. So not only do we have multiple rifles, shells, assassins, we also have multiple bags. Then we get to the trivia. Oswald left the book depository. So did many others. Question, would somebody who suddenly discovers he's been made a patsy hang around? Second question, if you're an assassin in that window on the 6th floor of a somewhat isolated building, it's not one of 1,000 in a row, there's 3 there. If you're an assassin in that window, realistically, what are your chances of firing 3 shots at the President of the United States and getting out of that building before it's sealed? They're slim or they're none. We're asked to believe that Oswald just calmly walked out. That either means that the perception was that the shots weren't fired there, or the person that fired them got out on his own leisure time, so to speak. Oswald was photographed with a Mannlicher Carcano. So was I, and I never shot at any president. Thank you. And I was a better shot than he was, too. There was a shirt fiber found in the butt plate on the rifle when the FBI took the shirt that Oswald was arrested in to Washington, and they took the rifle to Washington. There's only one problem. The shirt Oswald was wearing at the time of arrest was not the shirt he was wearing when the shots were fired. So here we have a shirt and a rifle, and lo and behold, it was a perfect match. But nobody managed to tell the FBI that at 12:30 that day, Oswald wasn't wearing the shirt that matched. The slide you saw of President Kennedy's tie was not done by a bullet. That was surgically done in the hospital. The front of his shirt, through all of the extensive analysis and the technology available in 1963, revealed the presence of absolutely no copper, which we are told was the jacketing of the bullet, and it would have to be there. We are asked to believe at face about Oswald's politics. The only thing I can tell you about Oswald's politics is who knows. He's been all things to all people. Which is the most likely to believe? That Oswald was the leftist radical, the Warren Commission and others would have us believe, and that he laid a paper trail to V.T. Lee in New York City, to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, or that simple Mr. Oswald was able to infiltrate the entire ultra-right-wing community of New Orleans, Ferry, Bannister, et al., which also included half of the former male population of Cuba. You decide that one. Oswald's police treatment. What's the probable cause for arrest? You know, calling all cars, somebody just broke into a theater? Now, they were looking for somebody, but the person that called it in had no reason to think that a crime had been committed. The police knew a crime had been committed. They knew two had been committed. They made the association a little too soon that one caused the other. Assistant District Attorney Alexander, at 1:15, when he heard about the tip, he said, "That's our man for the president." And that's believable if it had happened within 3 minutes of the president or within 3 blocks. But to suggest 45 minutes and a couple of miles is stretching things, unless, of course, you know who it is in advance you want to arrest. The Tippit killing was very convenient. It gave the public a perception that what's the 2 worst crimes? You kill a president, you kill a police officer. And they were able to hang Oswald for both of them. Bigger question is, and this is something that's still wide open for research, who and what was J.D. Tippit? I'll have quite a bit to say about that in my next upcoming work, but there's a lot more to be said also. Oswald was captured seemingly while seeking out a contact in the theater. If he was going to that theater to get away, he would have gone in the front door and gone out the back. And while the police are converging on the theater and searching it, he's getting away. Instead, he's moving from place to place in a 900-seat theater next to people. And they testified to that effect to the Warren Commission. And it's something you don't forget, because if you're sitting by yourself in a 900-seat theater and someone of the same sex comes over and sits next to you, you're going to remember it. Thank you. If we think long and hard about Oswald's treatment in the 47 hours that the police allowed him to live, he was treated more like a guest than a prisoner. Except for the time when he was led through the hall in handcuffs, he's not treated as your typical prisoner. He was exposed to constant danger. We know that. And the truth, and Oswald died as a result of that 2 days later. His answers were not recorded, which, by the way, is one of the major confusions in this case. They didn't have to be. He could have confessed 5 times in front of those people, and that evidence is not admissible in 1963. The historical record should have been maintained, and we know that. And they were taking statements all over. And I'll have quite a bit more to say about that this evening at the Revelations situation tonight. I strongly believe that the police were more concerned that they not take Oswald's statements down because of what they were afraid that they might hear, than not what that Oswald was going to just confess to being a lone assassin. He was arraigned for having shot the president and governor. He was never arraigned for Governor Connolly, but both of the documents suggest a 6.25 rifle, and there's no such gun. He was never even arraigned for the governor of Texas, suggesting there was no thought of a trial. And lo and behold, there never was one. At his press conference, which is a photo opportunity of equal note to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee events in New Orleans, it's just hard to imagine that every time some nut goes out and hands out a couple of leaflets that it makes television. We know better. And you're not going to win over the community of New Orleans by ordering 500 leaflets. How many people are you going to win as converts when you're handing out hands off Cuba to people coming off a United States ship, a naval ship? This is a resume, folks. And I would also like to add that nothing at the immediate time did more to convict Lee Oswald in the public eye than that midnight press conference. Here he is, here's the prisoner. But what did he say? I did it. The motive supposedly is he sought fame. There was fame looking him right in the eye. But he has to take a shower. That sounds like the confession of a grimy lone assassin. There were confessions that were not followed up. He said, I'm a patsy. Nobody ever asked him, for whom? And I can guarantee you the rawest rookie cop in Skunkville, Montana, if they had Lee Oswald in custody and he said, well, I'm a patsy, there would have been questions asked. With the Roger Craig situation in the station wagon, He said, they asked him about the station wagon, not telling him the year. And he said, that station wagon belongs to Mrs. Payne. She's not involved in any of this. That suggests to me very strongly that he did know who was involved with all of this, but it wasn't asked. Because if I came down here to Dallas and said, gee, I'm sorry about your quarterback, Dan Marino being hurt, but you're going to get by on Kozar, you're going to say, wait a minute, he's not our quarterback. That means you know who is. So if Oswald says Mrs. Payne, excuse me, Janet Williams, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. In my haste, when I saw the 5-minute notice, I got confused. When Janet had nothing to do with it. Oswald is then killed in custody. Conclusion. There's very little case when you come right down to it. There's a whole bunch of circumstantial evidence. There's a lot of props. There's a lot of propaganda. There's the accident that the gun and Oswald are on the cover of Life magazine the same week that his family is all being called to testify before the Warren Commission, which is in a chapter in the upcoming book called Life Be Not Proud. Oswald, I believe, would never have been tried for Kennedy's murder. And with no disrespect meant for the state of Texas, Lee Oswald would have been tried for the murder of Officer Tippit. And regardless of what we think about the evidence in that case, he would have been convicted. You put a Texas jury in 1963 with a commie and the given charge of shooting a police officer, he's gone. Now, should we spend another 30 million tax dollars in proving that he killed the president? Well, we know he did, and you can't fry him twice. And there could have been a Tippit trial, by the way, because Tippit did have an autopsy in Dallas. I'll be happy to take your questions later. I hope some of you come to listen to some research that I wasn't able to touch on in my time here that I think you'll find fascinating tonight, and I thank you for being a good audience.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Our next speaker will be Mark Zaid.
Thank you. Before I start my formal remarks, let me just offer a word of apology from Charles Sanders, who was supposed to have been on this panel. Charlie was the unfortunate victim of the American Airlines strike, which I'm surprised I haven't heard being blamed for a conspiracy not to have us all come here, but maybe that's being bantered around somewhere. But he couldn't get down here from New York, so I'm going to cover part of Charlie's remarks. Essentially, I'm going to cover two areas: a broad context of where we are and where we are at as far as legislative efforts to free all the documents and what could be made use of that. Now, after 30 years, I think what is extremely, not surprising, but interesting is the emotion involved with all this case. And the emotion that all of you feel, and of course that I feel from a different view because I was not alive at the time. I feel emotion towards it, but certainly not in the same vein. It's something I've been able to be very cognizant of from both yourselves and from clients that I have. My office represents Pan Am family members of Flight 103 that died in the Lockerbie bombing, and we're amidst in litigation against the government of Libya. And you cannot discuss many aspects with family members where that incident concerns. The emotion is so strong it might as well have been yesterday. Now, that's not the same level as far as what we've got here, but that emotion very much so directs how we view a lot of the evidence. And I think that's something we have to be very cognizant of. I don't think this case is closed, by no means. And I can demonstrate that very easily by telling you I have another client who is seeking the exhumation of John Wilkes Booth to see whether or not it was really him who was killed by federal troops. And in this case, we actually have the assistance of the federal government who is involved with that. Unfortunately, that's not the case with what we're here today. But part of what we're going to be talking about, for instance, tomorrow, is a call for action. And a call for action, to me, demonstrates that we've been able to hit each point from day one up until day now, and then decide where to go from there. I think more appropriately, we should call for a call of reflection and examine how we've gotten from day one to day here, or day, if that is day now, whatever. Because I think a great deal of the evidence that came forth in the beginning might have been misinterpreted or faulty. Not intentionally, not deliberately on various parts. And I'm not talking to specific researchers, I'm talking to, in generalities, to the government and to the research community. If we are arguing about factors now today that were based on faulty information from yesterday, then we're going nowhere. And there's too much that we've gotten to that point, primarily because the documents weren't available to us, or the witnesses wouldn't speak, or the witnesses have changed stories, that we're unable to proceed forward to a call of action. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. The other thing I want to just touch upon came out of the Chicago conference that we had back in end of March, April. And at the end of that, a group of us were supposed to form an umbrella organization. And suspecting that most of you, or many of you, were at that conference, I want to explain to you what happened from that. We did have a meeting in New York City to try and formalize some sort of organization. I'm not going to go into any of the politics that was involved with it, but there was a lack of consensus on how to proceed, and the effort ended up being dropped, mainly out of frustration. That's not to mean the work wasn't considered important by many of us, but it just was not going to come to be. Now, some of you actually sent me money for that, and I've kept it in my attorney escrow account as required, and I will return it to you if you would like, or I would donate it to the Assassination Archives and Research Center if you so choose, so you can contact me on that. But back to the regular remarks. What we've seen recently, because of the anniversary, has been extremely enlightening, I believe, with the rash of new books, particularly Gerald Posner's new book. Now, I'll tell you, I know Gerald Posner. I like Gerald Posner. I would trust him with my life. Just kidding. But for those of you in Chicago, you'll know what I'm talking about. But what has come out of that, and the people that I've talked to about that book, has really disturbed me. Not because of their criticism of Gerald's book, which I feel is extremely healthy, and I, for one, disagree with quite a bit in Gerald's book, and I've told him so. He misrepresents what failure analysis does. He chooses facts that support his theory, ignores others. He'll use one witness here and then destroy the same witness in the next paragraph. But yet I offer to you, out of all the other books that have come forth, does anyone not do the same? And the standard of review that we put to Gerald Posner has got to be given to every assassination book that comes out. Otherwise, we're not getting anywhere. Now, reasonable minds can differ, and rational minds can discuss this. And perhaps if we all get together and talk it over, then we can eventually solve the case to at least a reasonable standard. I think that's it was a very telling thing when I would have people call me and say, you know, Gerald's book is just garbage. I can't believe the conclusion. Well, why is that? Well, for one, it's got the fake backyard photo on the spine, so I'm not going to even look at it beyond that. Did you read it? No, it's not worth it. It is worth it. You have to read it. You have to refute it by specifics, not by generalities. That's not going to get you anywhere in the mainstream press if you're going to keep complaining about the press taking sides. You have to tell them why it is you think it's incorrect. Now, interpretation is another very important avenue. Don't impute to at least me that I was stating in my discussions yesterday that I said there was no conspiracy. I said no such thing. I'm not even going to comment on that. I indicated that I believe there was no evidence that Oswald was a spy during his time in the Soviet Union. I didn't go anywhere beyond that. If he was a spy in the Soviet Union for whoever, that might have nothing to do with the assassination. If he worked for the CIA in 1959, doesn't mean he worked for the CIA and killed President Kennedy in 1963. And it worked both ways. If he wasn't a CIA agent in 58, maybe he was in 63 and killed the president. I have no idea. But be very careful how you interpret people's remarks. One person had indicated legitimately, when I discussed the document about Oswald's venereal disease of all topics, that it doesn't matter because the date of the document, he wasn't even in this one location. Well, that's good. Look into that. I didn't say anything about that. I said the determination that said he had it in the line of duty not due to own misconduct was innocuous. And beyond that, the document doesn't mean anything. If you have another tact on that, then follow that through. But don't try and take me down on that point by throwing something else at me that doesn't answer what I raised. Eyewitness testimony, we'll have that tomorrow. A great deal of it. And it's very important, of course. If Oswald had ever gone to trial, eyewitness testimony would have been crucial. Most lawyers and psychologists understands inappropriate, deal with the problems and unreliability of eyewitness testimony. And myself and Dennis Ford, who is a professor of psychology, have put together a paper on the principles of this. And I have it for everyone to read. And I'm not stating anything of the sort that so-and-so lied or so-and-so has an agenda or anything like that. But I think in pursuit of this case, we need to be aware of professional and scientific interpretations that are outside of assassination work per se. That we can take the work of fields of science that have a peripheral involvement and then apply it to the assassination. The paper will be available. All I ask is that you read it, and when you see the eyewitnesses, you just possibly raise it to them or raise it to yourself as to how that goes. Now, I don't want to criticize any one author. That's not what I'm here to do. I want to bring up one in particular, though, and I wish he was here. And I only do so because he's put forth certain events in his role as an attorney rather than in his role as an assassination author, and that's Mark Lane. There have been many attorneys involved with this case. The Warren Commission, obviously, the House Select Committee, all the government investigations. There have been many authors who have been attorneys, but very few have acted as attorneys. You know, Mark North, Craig Zerbel, they're all attorneys, Mark Lane, but they haven't acted as it. Mark Lane's plausible denial book, he acts as an attorney. And he acts very inappropriate because he puts forth to you legal principles that he knows are incorrect in his reporting. And that had to do with the trial of Hunt v. Liberty Lobby, which dealt with a libel case of E. Howard Hunt and the Tramp issue against a magazine that had printed a story by Victor Marchetti. And in that case, the court had decided that there had been no malice for publication. The jury had decided. The laws of libel are very straightforward as far as what the jury needs to decide. The case was not one of was there CIA involvement, was E. Howard Hunt involved in the case. It was whether this article published by Liberty Lobby was one of malice. And that was not the decision of the jury. And by telling you that the jury, the forewoman, says, I think that this case decides the CIA was behind the assassination, is irresponsible, or unresponsible, or whatever. And if you look at any of the newspaper articles that came out about this case, they quote almost all the other jurors saying that that was not true. The case was decided on the law, not on the facts. They never even looked at the conspiracy factor. And to that I take exception because I think he puts lawyers in a bad light, worse than we already are, which is hard enough to deal with, by offering to you information that you would not know to be faulty. So I throw that out to you. The other thing is coincidences. And we always hear of all the many coincidences of this case. And I'm not going to comment on this case, but let me just tell you, one of the other hats I wear involves ocean liners, historic ocean liners, particularly the Titanic, actually. And I'm on a board of trustees of an organization that is involved with many authors of the Titanic and even those who actually dove on the ship most recently, and we're organizing tours of the artifacts and things like that. I've come across I don't know, you would say eyewitnesses, people. There was this one woman in particular who sailed on the Titanic, survived, then for however, ended up on the Lusitania that was then torpedoed, and then went down on a ship on World War I. And I've never heard among any of the people in this shipping line industry that she was to blame for any of these ships going down. So, I mean, coincidences do happen. It's very hard to rationalize when we're dealing with this type of case. But I thought that was interesting when I thought about it. 90% of the public being behind this. Certainly very important. but something we also have to think about. That remaining 10% is very important, because within that remaining 10% are very influential people. Congress, politicians in general, many of the attorneys that you would call upon to prosecute this case, many of them are within that 10%. And I think a great demonstration of that would have been the 1992 senatorial elections, when Arlen Specter ran for re-election of U.S. Senate against Lynn Yackel, and Arlen Specter won. And did you ever hear Lynn Yackel bring up the fact that Arlen was the originator of the single bullet theory? Did she bring it up? Well, then if she brought it up within Pennsylvania, it obviously didn't grab 90% of the voters. I think that says something. I'm not saying the veracity of the single bullet theory or anything like that. I'm just telling you that the people we need to reach, this is not reaching into the present day politics. And this goes right into my next thing, where to go from here. I honestly and truly believe that an investigation now or a special prosecutor is entirely premature. Absolutely. What are we going to offer to evidence? Nothing that we have not discussed before. The medical evidence is very, very important. But let me just tell you what happened the other day when we were at the congressional hearings on the legislation. And Dr. Randy Robertson, who unfortunately is not here today, testified. Congressman Conyers laid into him like you wouldn't believe. Incredible. I'm not stating anything about what Dr. Robertson said or not, because I have realized I don't want to go anywhere near the medical evidence anymore. I have no understanding of this. But the congressmen that were at that hearing were not impressed. And I don't say that as a judgment against Randy. I say that if you want a new investigation, you're in a lot of trouble, because if you want a congressional investigation. I deal in my practice with high-level Justice Department officials. I deal in my FOIA practice with the CIA General Counsel's Office and the FBI's Counsel's Office and the Department of Justice Counsel's Office. And let me tell you, there's no way that they would ever call for an investigation. If you want to have a private investigation like us, this is important. We need to continue this. We need to keep doing research. We need to go through these documents. But don't waste your time calling for a new investigation. Congress is not going to approve of the money. No state government or legislature is going to approve of the money. Not when you have children killing one another. Not when you can't get the Brady bill passed. Not when you're arguing about NAFTA. We just have to be realistic about it. I'm not saying that we can't prosecute somebody one day, but there's nothing here now. Do you see anyone banging down the door of Robert Morrow or Chauncey Holt or Marita Lorenz? Did I read their books incorrectly when I saw that they said they were involved implicitly in the assassination of President Kennedy? Did I miss that? I don't think so. But yet they're still walking around and no prosecutor is talking to them. There are no more Jim Garrisons. We're not going to get that. Just keep that in mind. Now, where does the legislation stand? The legislation was signed October 26, and it called for the nomination of 5 review board members to occur by 90 days, which would have been on or about January 25th, January 26th. It never came for several reasons. One, our eminent president, former President George Bush, just happened to take all the documents with him when he left his office, and Clinton's people didn't have the nominees for a while. And then 2, for the very reason you've seen most of the nominations be held up. There's been a very, very slow process. And several of us contemplated, or at least the ARC contemplated, filing a mandamus action to compel the nominations. And you might have heard about that. That was reported in U.S. News and World Report. It didn't come to fruition because there was a very legitimate problem with powers between the legislature and the executive branch. And if they had brought the lawsuit, it very well could have dragged out the legislation beyond where it's going to be because of a very serious constitutional argument. So just so that you know that. 4 members were nominated, were named, and then the 5th one was finally named just about 2 weeks ago. So the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee now has the 5 names. The 30-day period of session days, mind you. Session days, they only have about 2 or 3 session days a week. Session days is not a calendar day or a working day. They have 30 session days to hold hearings. Last I talked to the counsel of the Senate committee, it looks unlikely that they're going to have the hearings before their Thanksgiving break. They don't return to session until January. That is the atrocity. That is where we need to focus on what is going on. We need to get this review board in place. The agencies have been releasing documents in bulk and in gaps. Majority came at the end of August. You all saw that on television and news media. Most of that had already been released. But a great deal, as John Newman said the other day, has been forthcoming. The FBI has not given anything over. But many of the House Select Committee documents, many CIA, many State Department documents, which I spoke about yesterday, have been released. Many in unredacted form, some in some redacted form, but you can get a great deal, more so than ever before. What we need to do is focus on this legislation. Nothing is going to happen until this review board finishes its tenure. No one, if you approach Congress, they're going to say, wait until the review board. How can you say there's nothing in the documents if you haven't looked at them? How could Gerald Posner say the case is closed and you call for a new investigation when no one has looked at the documents? Perhaps the answers are in there. Not to say who did it. What we're finding so far is that there are answers to questions that move away from conspiracy, but many questions that move towards conspiracy that haven't been answered yet. We need to examine that. You need to examine that. You need to make sure that everyone who is qualified knows about these documents. You need to ensure that such and such person doesn't hold on to this one because of whatever reason and doesn't talk to this one who has knowledge. Share it. Let's get together, for God's sake. Let's work on this. I don't want to spend the rest of my life dealing with this. And I don't know if any of you want to. But it would be very nice to have a resolution to the best of our ability as to this case. The legislation, which Charles and I have written a law review article on, and I have available for you here today, and it's not for sale, it's free, it's publicly available, the Congress is printing it in their hearings, so please don't attach an agenda to me. The article is an analysis of the legislation. It doesn't say anything about who did what or where. It describes to the review board documents we need to have disclosed and people we need to have subpoenaed. They have very special powers. They have the ability to form advisory committees, which would be you, experts on all sides, to advise them where to look. When the review board gets named, you remind them of that they have that power. They don't have to exercise that power. If you tell them they should, maybe they will. FOIA is involved with all this. I don't want to go into the boring details of Freedom of Information Act and Privacy Act. Talk to me if you're interested in knowing about it, if you're interested in knowing how to utilize it to get information in certain areas on yourself or on this case or any other case. I'll be very willing to talk to you about it. But go down to the National Archives and start looking through these documents. Start thinking amongst yourselves what you want to see answered. And when this review board does get in place, and remind your congressional representatives that this review board, by law, is to be in place. Then, let's move forward. But beyond that, let's work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to give Dr. Artwohl the additional 5 minutes that I promised him a while ago, but before I do that, I want to make a couple of points. First of all, I respect my colleague, Mark Zaid, but just because he speaks as an attorney doesn't mean all attorneys agree about everything that he said. I personally think we need to have a new investigation right here in Dallas County, Texas. Jim DiEugenio asked me to remind you that tonight at 10:30 at Dealey Plaza, there is a candlelight vigil that everyone is encouraged to attend. I understand that Marina Porter may be there, Dr. Wecht may be there, and John Newman, and a lot of others. So that's something you probably don't want to miss. Secondly, I want to remind you about something else. Tomorrow afternoon, I want to call your attention to the fact that Dr. Robert Livingston, that's no relation to Harry, will be on the panel tomorrow afternoon, and I don't think you want to miss what he has to say. Some of you may know I've been involved in some litigation here recently that's related to the case, and yesterday Dr. Livingston was brave and kind enough to give his deposition testimony at my office. And I would point out that my direct exam lasted only a half hour, but then Dr. Livingston had to endure 5 hours of cross-examination, and he never wavered. And I want to commend him on that, and I want to thank him for that. So you don't want to miss what he has to say tomorrow. Okay, Dr. Artwohl, it's yours.
All right. I don't really have much to say. I just want to make a few comments on Gary's talk. I am not a member of JAMA. I've never been a member of JAMA, and I don't subscribe to the magazine. And I disagree with their position on health policy. I think this country needs a big change in the way we administer health care. Dr. Aguilar said that experts can't make mistakes, or implied that how could any pathologist make such a basic error? But it's very interesting. Can I have a skull slide? Because in my mind, there's a confusion when people say the back of the head, and I think there is just, I think it's a, well, hold on, let me get going here. I'm not convinced I'm not convinced that the doctors could not see the cerebellum, and I'll show you. Well, just give me a skull film. Well, while he's finding a skull film, it's very curious. When you read the CIA Commission's medical opinions by the pathologist, one of the neuropathologists refers to the bullet fragment in the occiput. Now, the bullet fragment he says in the occiput is actually in the parietal bone. So even and this is a neuropathologist. This gentleman specializes in making assessments of head pathology. So even among experts, there is some confusion and loose use of the terminology. That's not an X-ray. I need a skull film. I read Dr. Wecht's book. I have great respect for Dr. Wecht as a pathologist. In fact, I agree with almost everything he said about the conduct of the autopsy. And I think I would endorse many of the claims. But Dr. Wecht, a pathologist who's been studying this assassination and the wounds of the President Kennedy and President Connally, has made a very basic error. In his book and in his testimony to the ABA trial, he mentions that the radial nerve is responsible or contributes to grip strength. The radial nerve in Connally's wrist that was damaged was only a sensory nerve. It supplies sensation only to the back of the hand. It has nothing to do with grip strength. Nothing. The radial nerve, in fact, never contributes any fibers to nerves responsible for grip. So you have to understand when you hear from doctors, when you hear from Dr. Gilbert Mudge, a famous cardiologist, told that basketball player, what was his name? Boston Celtics, that he didn't have a cardiomyopathy. He dropped dead from a cardiomyopathy playing basketball. So you really have to take what experts tell you, and you have to take what I tell you, and everybody here tells you with some skepticism. I'm not here to convince anybody of anything. Now, again, this is parietal. I noticed that one of the doctors, Dallas, it's interesting, one of the, in the Groden film clip, one of the doctors, which one was it? Dr. Sawyer points back here and refers to this as parietal area. You have to understand there's a great amount of confusion. Now, the back of the head, part of the back of the head is missing, and it's back to here. If you're laying on a stretcher, the entire back of the head here is missing, is gone. And when President Kennedy is laying on a stretcher, I submit to you, when they in their mind, they fixed the idea that the back of the head, as far as they could see, was missing. And later on in their recollection, they basically, the ear is here, here's the ear, the wound clearly extends behind the ear. I am not saying that the wound is only here. The wound basically occupies most of the top of the head, the top front of the head, and the top rear of the head. So that's my opinion on the x-rays, and I just think that you have to take all this business about front and back and parietal and occipital loosely, because there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of imprecise terminology. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We're going to start back up at 4:10 or 4:11. I also want to